evening, everyone, and a very happy new year to all of you. Thanks very much for coming to Gresham College, whether you are attending online or whether you've braved the weather, which is really foul outside, and attend here in the hall. A couple of things before I introduce our speaker. So your housekeeping announcement, exits are in the back, one there, one there. If there's a fire alarm, it's for real, please leave, and a member of the team will help you find the meeting point. The lecture will be followed, as always, by a Q&A. You can either raise your hands, and my colleague will bring you the microphone. If you do not want to do this, if you're in the hall, there will be the QR codes over there. You can scan them, and we'll collect questions on a tablet. Those of you who attend online, you can also send us your questions, and I'll try to mix them up between online questions and questions from the hall. And then another bit, unfortunately, Thursday's lecture by Professor Clive Stafford-Smith has to be postponed because Clive is unwell at the moment. We'll try to find a new date. So if you've signed up for that one as well, please, do not come here. We'll inform everyone who's got a ticket when the next available date will be for that one. But today, we're going to start the new year with business. Professor Daniel Susskind will give you the third lecture in the series on economics and artificial intelligence, in which he explores the history of the relationship between AI and work and how economists have tried to make sense of it all. And without further ado, I think I'll leave the stage.
Thank you very much.
So Daniel,
thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good evening to everyone in the room, and good evening to everyone watching online. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening to deliver my third lecture on economics and artificial intelligence. And I want to dive straight in. At the start of 2023, something extraordinary happened. ChatGPT, an AI developed by this team at OpenAI, Mira Murati, Sam Altman, Greg Brockman, and Ilya Sutskever, became the fastest growing app in terms of users ever. It had taken TikTok 9 months to reach 100 million users. It had taken Instagram 2 years to reach 100 million users, but OpenAI took just 2 months to reach 100 million users with ChatGPT. So here was a system, an AI system, that could seemingly answer questions on almost anything in the world, in many cases to a standard that seemed to resemble, or in some cases exceed, what human beings were capable of doing. And this was just the start. What we saw in the months afterwards was a whole spread of generative AI systems, and there was extraordinary excitement about them, not just ChatGPT, but Claude, developed by Anthropic, Gemini, developed by Google, Grok, developed by X. It felt like something very important, very significant had just begun. But this recent burst of progress in artificial intelligence has not come out the blue. It's a chapter in a far longer story, a story that's been unfolding now for many decades. And it's a story where AI gradually, but pretty relentlessly, takes on more and more tasks and activities that until recently we thought only human beings alone could ever do. And I've watched this story myself for the last 15 years or so, but it's been going on far longer than that. And crucially, it has left many economists flat-footed in how they think about the impact of technology on work in particular. And this is the bigger story that I want to explore this evening. And in particular, I want to do 4 different things with you. The first is I want to set out the history of artificial intelligence. It doesn't begin in late 2022, early 2023. I want to tell the full and, in my view, fascinating history of artificial intelligence. The second thing I want to do is explain why I think what has happened in the last few years is particularly important. There's been various attempts to interpret this history. I want to share my own interpretation. I want to use this history of artificial intelligence to set out a a revolution that I think has happened, and it's a revolution that's valuable for thinking about what's going on at the moment in the world of artificial intelligence, particularly with generative AI. The third thing I want to do is explain why this revolution matters for thinking about economics, and in particular thinking about the impact of technology on work. And finally, I want to bring all of these ideas that I'm going to share with you this evening together in one concept, which is what I call task encroachment. And I'll say more on that in a moment, but it's going to be a really important concept in my view for making sense of the impact of technology, and particularly AI on work. So that's the plan, and I want to begin with the history. Human beings have shared stories for a long, long time about machines that could do really remarkable things. So 3,000 years ago, the ancient Greek poet Homer told a tale of driverless three-legged stools made by a god, Hephaestus, the god of fire, that would scuttle towards their owner at his command. The philosopher Plato wrote of Daedalus, a sculptor that was so talented, his statues were so lifelike, they had to be tied down in order to stop them running away. Now, this story might sound a little bit absurd, but it troubled Plato's student Aristotle so much that he wondered what would happen to the world of work if every tool we had could perform its task either at our bidding or itself perceiving the need. The old Jewish sages wrote of mystical creatures called golem, fashioned out of mud and clay, which would come to life to help their owners at the muttering of the right incantation. And it's said that one golem called Yosef still lies hidden in the attic of the Grand Synagogue in Prague. Centuries ago, according to the legend, a Rabbi Judah Loew, brought him to life in order to protect the Jews in his community from persecution. Now, tales of this kind are just scattered through ancient writing, but recent history is also full of them too, these fables of wonderful, strange inventions of machines that could go about their work without any apparent human involvement. Today, we call them robots. But before that word was invented at the start of the 20th century, they were called automata, and they were wildly popular. So one of my favorite examples is in the 18th century. A Frenchman called Jacques de Vaucanson became famous for his robots. One that could play the flute, another that could clatter tambourines in time, and his most celebrated, a duck that could eat, drink, flap its wings, and defecate. So disappointingly, the so-called canard digérateur, or digesting duck, was not actually true to its name. Hidden Compartment apparently simply released a convincing alternative to the real thing, which were breadcrumbs dyed green. I should say, I wasn't entirely satisfied by this newspaper clipping from the time, so I naturally asked GPT to bring it to life for me. This is what it came up with. Now, I mean, in the end, almost all these accounts were fictional. Many designs scribbled down by inventors remained completely speculative, and they were never built. And the machines that did get built, like this one here, tended to rely upon trickery. But in the 20th century, this all changed. For the first time, researchers started to build machines with the serious intention of rivaling human beings. A proper sophisticated program of constructing intelligence was underway. And the shift in seriousness begins, I think, in 1947, actually just down the road, at a meeting of the London Mathematical Society, when this man, Alan Turing, stood up and told the gathering that he had conceived of a computing machine that could exhibit intelligence. Now, Turing deserved to be taken seriously. As many of you will know, he was, of course, Britain's leading wartime codebreaker. He's one of the greatest computer scientists to have ever lived. But in that moment, in 1947, he was not taken seriously. And you can see this, in fact, in his writing at the time. He's incredibly frustrated at how conservative, how dismissive his scientific peers were about his ideas. His ideas would not actually be taken seriously for about another decade or so, when a group of American scholars in 1955, John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Nathaniel Rochester, and Claude Shannon, sent a proposal, this proposal, to the Rockefeller Foundation for what they call the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence. So this is the 1955 proposal that they wrote, and I just pulled out an excerpt from it, my favorite excerpt. We proposed that a 2-month, 10-man study of artificial intelligence be carried out during the summer of 1956 at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. The study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. We think that a significant advance can be made in one or more of these problems if a carefully selected group of scientists work on it together for the summer. So I just love the sort of early hope and optimism that they set out with in the 50s. And they received the funding for this project. This is them gathered together just outside the mathematics department in Dartmouth in 1956. Now, as it happened, no particular advance worth celebrating is made in that summer. But I don't think it was a failure. What happened was a community formed, a direction of travel was established, and a handful of great minds began to work together. And what happened in the years that followed was, in the first few years that followed, was an eclectic collection of different types of problems would be swept together under this banner that they conceived of as artificial intelligence. Things like recognizing human speech, analyzing images and objects, translating and interpreting written text, playing games like drafts and chess, and problem solving. But, and this really is crucial, these researchers believed that there was one fundamental solution to all those different types of problems. And this was the solution, that building a machine to perform a given task meant observing how human beings perform that task and then copying them. They believed, in some sense, that artificial intelligence had to ride on the coattails of human intelligence. Now, this was true in 1956 at that Dartmouth gathering, but what you see is that actually it's true for artificial intelligence researchers for almost all of the rest of the 20th century that follows. So why do artificial intelligence researchers believe this, starting in 1956 and for the rest of the 20th century? Why do they believe that the only way to outperform human beings is to somehow build a machine that copies them? I think there are two main reasons for this. The first reason is the simplest, I think, which is that human beings were by far the most capable machines in existence. So it must have seemed entirely sensible to build new machines in their image, albeit machines made out of silicon rather than flesh. And the way I've come to think about it is picture a mountain, the capability mountain. And there's lots of machines clustered together at the bottom of this mountain. As those machines become more capable, as they're able to perform more and more tasks in the world, the machines move up the mountain, this capability mountain. They climb in the mountains. But sitting on top of the mountains are human beings, endowed with remarkable capabilities, looking down on all the other machines that are trying to clamber up to them. So this capability mountain captures two ideas. The first is that there's some sort of peak in the capabilities of machines represented by human capabilities. The second important feature is that the only pathway up this mountain, the only way to build machines that become more capable, is to become more like those human machines sitting on the top, to copy the way that human beings think and reason. So that is, I think, the first reason that these AI researchers set out to copy and imitate, replicate the way that human beings act in the world in building their machines. Intelligence researchers in the second half of the 20th century think of themselves as cognitive scientists rather than computer scientists. They imagine that they are actually working in a subfield of a far bigger project, the project of understanding the human brain. For many researchers, the project of understanding human intelligence for its own sake was simply just far more interesting than merely building capable machines that could do impressive things. This was the central purpose of artificial intelligence, to better understand human intelligence. So as John Searle, the great late American philosopher, put it, he said the only purpose of artificial intelligence was, quote, as a very powerful tool in the study of the mind. And you can really see this in their writings in the second half of the 20th century, the writings of researchers in artificial intelligence. It's full of excited references to classical thinkers and their reflections on the human mind, people like Leibniz and Descartes and Hume. These were the sorts of figures in whose footsteps artificial intelligence researchers thought they were following. They were thrilled not by questions about machines, but about human beings. What is a mind? How does consciousness work? What does it really mean to think or to understand? And so again, this is the central philosophy, it seems to me, that guides a lot of work, in fact, almost all the work in artificial intelligence in the second half of the 20th century. So how do researchers go about actually trying to copy human beings, trying to mimic human intelligence when they were building their AIs? I think there are three main ways they tried to do this. One was that some researchers actually tried to copy the physical structure of the human brain, tried to create networks of artificial neurons. So Marvin Minsky, who I mentioned before, one of the authors of that Rockefeller pitch for funding, he actually wrote his PhD thesis on this idea in 1954, so the year before that pitch to Rockefeller. So the first was to try and actually copy the physical structure of the human brain. The second way that these researchers tried to copy human intelligence was a more psychological approach. What they tried to do was replicate the thinking and the reasoning processes in which the human brain appeared to be engaged. So that was what the Dartmouth attendees here, Herbert Simon and Alan Newell, tried to do with a program that they developed in 1957 called the General Problem Solver. It was based on what they thought was the thinking and the reasoning processes that human beings seem to follow. The third approach, and it was the most popular one, was to try and draw out the rules, the particular rules that human beings seem to follow, and then write instructions based on those human rules for these systems to follow. And this was the approach that dominated a lot of work in artificial intelligence, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. And I know a lot about this. You know, it's not a coincidence that I share a family resemblance to this man. He is, in fact, my father, Richard Susskind, because he was part of the vanguard here. And he, in fact, co-developed the world's first commercially available expert system, AI system in the law in the 1980s. I'll just say, because this was the most popular approach, I just want to say just a little bit more about it. And in his particular case, because I think it's quite illustrative for thinking about what these researchers were actually trying to do, something really interesting happened in 1986 in the UK, which was a very difficult piece of legislation was passed called the Latent Damage Act. And it turned out that the leading expert in the world at the time on this very particular piece of law was a man called Philip Capper. And Philip happened to be the dean of the law school at Oxford, where my dad was doing his doctorate at the time. And Philip came to my dad and said, look, this is completely absurd. Anytime anyone wants to understand if this law applies to them, they have to come to me. And so what he said was, look, why don't we build a system based on my expertise that people could use instead of having to come to me? And that's exactly what they did from 1986 to 1988. As I said, they worked in the development of this, the first commercially available AI system in the law. This was the home screen design for the system that my dad built. I should say, he assures me this was a cool screen design in the 1980s. Never been entirely convinced by that. Just to give you a flavor of what they were up against, though, here's an extract from that 1986 legislation. Section 2 of this act shall not apply to an action to which this section applies. I can tell you that's a readily understandable piece of the law. I love this. They published it in the form of floppy disks at a time where floppy disks genuinely were still floppy. And essentially what they did together was they built a gigantic decision tree where you answered yes or no questions and you navigated through a tree that had quite literally millions of branches through it. that my dad and his colleagues had manually, painstakingly crafted in their computer science laboratory. Again, based on the rules that a human lawyer, in my dad's case, this man, Philip Kappa, seemed to be following when they were deciding whether or not this law applied to you. So these were the three approaches that dominated in the second half of the 20th century: the anatomical approach, the psychological approach, the expert systems approach. What they were all doing, though, was the same thing: trying to build capable machines by copying or mimicking or replicating human beings. Now, as many of you will know, as the 1980s came to an end and as the 1990s began, essentially research, interest, funding, progress in artificial intelligence dried up. And a period known as the AI winter began, when really not a lot happened in the field at all. But there was, in fact, a revolution in store. That winter would only last a few years. And I want to turn now to spend a little bit of time thinking about what changed in the world of AI and why it matters for thinking about the moment we're in at present. The great turning point, of course, comes in 1997. And this is when Garry Kasparov, who at the time is the world chess champion, is beaten by a computer system owned by IBM called Deep Blue. It's an amazing achievement, and I imagine almost all of you are familiar with it. But what's so interesting about this is that if you had gone back to the 1980s and said to my dad and his colleagues, and remember, they were some of the most open-minded, some of the most progressive, some of the most ambitious people thinking about AI back then, if you had said to them, do you think something like this will ever be possible? Do you think we'll ever do it? They would have said to you emphatically, no, we'll never do it. And the reason why they would have said no is very important, and it's very important for thinking about what's going on at the moment in AI. The reason they would have said no was because at the time they were of that expert systems mindset. This idea that the only way to outperform a human being is to try and figure out the rules that human beings are following and then somehow get a machine to follow those rules. But here's the problem, and Garry Kasparov is a really good example of this problem. If you sat down with Garry Kasparov and said, Garry, tell me how it is you're so good at chess, he might be able to give you a few clever opening moves or closing plays, but in the end, he'd struggle. He'd say it requires things like creativity, judgment, intuition. In short, he would say to you, I cannot articulate exactly how it is I'm so good at chess. And that was why my dad and his colleagues thought something like this just could never be automated. If a human being cannot articulate how they perform a task, if they can't explain the rules that they follow, the reasoning that they're going through, the thought processes in their mind, where on earth do we begin? These researchers thought in writing a set of instructions for a machine to follow. Now, what they hadn't banked on, the mistake that those researchers made back in the 1980s, and I think in some sense it's understandable, was that they just did not anticipate the explosive growth in processing power, in particular, that would happen in the second half of the 20th century. And I've shown this slide in earlier lectures, but it's useful just to see it again, just to hammer this home. I'm using here index of computations per second as a measure of computational power. What you can see there from 1850 to 1950 is not a lot seems to happen to processing power. That line looks relatively flat. And then beginning in 1950, you get what looks like an exponential, or you get what looks like a linear increase in computational power. Only the key point here is that, of course, that is not a linear, a steady increase. The y-axis here is logarithmic, which means each step up on that y-axis is a 10-fold increase in computational power. 2 steps, 100-fold. 3 steps, 1,000-fold. 4 steps, 10,000-fold. So what you're actually looking at there is an explosive, an exponential increase in computational power. And that essentially is what my dad and his colleagues just did not anticipate in the 1980s. So by the time that Garry Kasparov sat down with Deep Blue, and remember this was more than 25 years ago, Deep Blue was already calculating up to 330 million moves a second. Garry Kasparov, at best, could juggle 110 moves in his head on any one turn. He was blown out the water by brute force processing power and also a huge amount of data storage capability. It did not matter, and this is the key point, it did not matter that Garry Kasparov couldn't articulate the rules that he was following, the system was playing the game in a fundamentally different way to him. Now, Deep Blue really was a remarkable achievement. But even more remarkable, and I really just want to emphasize this, is Deep Blue did not try to copy Kasparov's creativity, his intuition, his genius. It wasn't trying to replicate his thinking process, the reasoning that he followed. It wasn't following the rules that Kasparov was relying upon. It was a practical triumph in the sense that the system beat a world champion at chess, and it was remarkable. But it was also an ideological triumph as well. We can think of most AI researchers up until that moment as being purists, closely observing human beings acting intelligently and trying in the various ways that I described to build machines like them. But again, that wasn't how Deep Blue was designed. Its creators didn't set out to copy the anatomy of the human brain, the thinking or the reasoning that we follow, or the rules that we rely upon. Instead, they were pragmatists. They took a task that required immense amounts of human intelligence from us and built a machine to perform it in a fundamentally different way to us. And that is what brought artificial intelligence out of its winter at the turn of the century, what I call the pragmatist revolution. And in the decades since Deep Blue's victory, a generation of systems have now been built in this pragmatist spirit, crafted to function very differently from us, very differently from human beings, judged not by how they perform a task, but by how well they perform it. And my favorite example of this shift from purism to pragmatism took place in 2011, when another system owned by IBM, this one called Watson, went on the US quiz show Jeopardy, and it beat the two human champions at the game of Jeopardy. And it was an amazing moment. And again, I'm sure lots of people will be familiar with it. But what I love about this, looking back on it again 15 years later, was that the day after Watson won on Jeopardy, the Wall Street Journal ran a terrific piece by the great philosopher John Searle with the title, "Watson Doesn't Know It Won on Jeopardy." Right? And it's brilliant, and it's completely true. Watson didn't let out a cry of excitement. It didn't call up its parents to say what a good job it had done. It didn't want to go down to the proverbial pub for a drink. The system wasn't trying to copy the way that those human contestants thought or the way that they reasoned, but it didn't matter. It still outperformed them. Just to the AV team, my slides are jumping ahead a little bit, so if we can... Terrific. And we have seen this repeatedly in the last few years as well. So machines have learned to classify images, for instance, not by mimicking human vision, but by reviewing millions of previously labeled pictures and hunting for similarities between them and the particular photo in question. So the ImageNet project, for instance, hosts an annual contest where leading computer scientists compete to build systems that can identify objects in an image more accurately than their peers. And what you can see here is they're well off back in 2010, and yet by 2015, the winning system outperforms human beings for the first time. It's correctly identifying images 96% of the time. In 2017, the winner reaches 98% accuracy. Again, the system isn't trying to copy the way that we identify images, is doing it in a fundamentally different way to us. So the interesting question then is why? Why does this revolution happen? Why does this shift from purism to pragmatism take place? And I think it's a mistake to think that researchers simply discover the pragmatist path in a sort of eureka moment in the early 1990s. That this choice between having machines solve problems by any means possible and having them specifically copy the human approach between pragmatism and purism, it's not actually a particularly new idea. So if you go back to Alan Newell and Herbert Simon, back in 1961, they write how we need to draw a careful line between the attempt to accomplish with machines the same tasks that humans perform and the attempt to simulate the processes humans actually use to accomplish these tasks. So the kind of distinction isn't entirely new. I think the best way to think about what happens, why this pragmatist revolution takes place, is to go back to that capability mountain from before. And remember, this captures two ideas. The first is that human beings are the most capable machines in existence, sitting on top of that mountain. The second idea is that the only way to achieve artificial intelligence is to somehow copy human intelligence, to take the same route that human beings took up that mountain. So I think the first thing that happens here is new summits appear in the capability mountains. Achievements like Deep Blue, like Watson, driven by remarkable advances in processing power, in data storage capability, and more recently in algorithm design, make people realize that actually human beings might not be the most capable machine after all. What's more, this new summit is shrouded in mystery. It's unclear, and it's still unclear to us today, where the summit in these machine capabilities might lie. There's no reason to think that human capabilities give us a very good insight into the limits of machine capabilities. The second thing that happens is that it becomes very clear that these remarkable advances, again, in processing power, data storage capability, and algorithm design, mean that new paths appear up this mountain. Not only does it become clear that human capabilities don't represent any sort of summit or peak in machine capabilities, but it also becomes clear that there are other ways to build machines than simply copying or replicating or imitating human intelligence. There's other routes to ascend in these capability mountains. And so, at the end of the century, this pragmatist revolution unfolds. We see across the world of AI this shift from purism to pragmatism, a belief away from the idea that the only way to build machines is to copy human intelligence, to recognizing that there are other ways to build incredibly capable machines. And that is how I think about the systems that are being developed today. Systems like GPT, Claude, Gemini, Grok. It is another chapter in this pragmatist revolution. These systems don't think like us. They don't reason like us. They certainly don't feel like us. But that doesn't, to an extent, matter, because these systems might be able to perform tasks that require us to think or reason or feel in the particular way that we do. But these systems are able to perform those tasks in fundamentally different ways. And so what it's meant from a practical point of view is that a whole realm of activity that people only a few decades ago thought was comfortably out of reach of automation turns out not to be out of reach at all. And it's this, it seems to me, that has a really important implications for thinking about economics, and in particular the impact of technology on work. And I want to turn to do that now. And I want to begin in thinking about economics with a question. What are the tasks of driving a car, making a medical diagnosis, and identifying a bird at a fleeting glimpse have in common? What do these tasks all have in common? Well, these are tasks that until pretty recently, leading economists thought could not readily be automated. And yet today, all of them can be. Almost all major car manufacturers have some sort of driverless car program. There's countless systems out there that can make medical diagnosis, and there's even an app developed by the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, which if you give it a photo of a bird, it will tell you what it is right away. So what went wrong? Why did these economists, leading economists, systematically underestimate the capabilities of machines? What's interesting is that if you look at the work that economists were doing until relatively recently, these economists were old-fashioned purists. They believed in much the same way that my dad and his colleagues and many of the artificial intelligence researchers in the 20th century believed. They believed that machines had to copy the way that humans thought and reasoned in order to outperform them. So when these economists were trying to determine which tasks machines could and could not do, They imagined that the only way to automate a task was exactly as my dad had imagined. Sit down with a human being, get them to explain to you how they perform a task, and then write a set of instructions based on that human explanation for an AI to follow. So if human beings could readily explain how they did something, if they could easily articulate the rules that they followed, well, that task, economists said, was routine. And that was the sort of thing that could be automated. But other tasks, those where we struggle to articulate how we do them, when we can't give the exact rules that we follow, those are non-routine tasks, and those are out of reach of automation. And all those tasks from before, making a medical diagnosis, driving a car, identifying a bird at a fleeting glimpse, those are all classic cases of non-routine tasks. They're all classic examples of tasks where it's actually quite difficult to explain exactly how it is that we do them. So let me just pick up on one of them. So here's the paper I have in mind from 2003, written by, again, many of the great economists in the field. You might remember last time I spoke about medical diagnosis. Here, they are identifying medical diagnosis as a task that cannot be automated. And with that in mind, these economists built stories and models based on those sorts of assumptions about the impact of technology on work. Why did they think that medical diagnosis couldn't be automated? Well, if you go to a doctor and say, look, and you say, I've got this, cut, is it, I've got this ailment, what's wrong with me? They might, and they give you an answer, and then you say, well, hold on a second, how did you get that answer? They might begin by pointing you to the right page of the medical encyclopedia, but in the end, they're going to say things like, well, it was just, gut reaction, instinct, intuition, experience, judgment, creativity. I just sort of looked you in the eye. I just had a feeling when you came in the room. The inability of human beings to articulate how they make tasks like a medical diagnosis, leading economists thought represented a bottleneck on automation. And yet, of course, within a decade or so, that turned out not to be right. So this is the system that I mentioned in previous lectures, system developed at Stanford that tells you whether or not a freckle is cancerous as accurately as leading dermatologists. How does this system actually work? What's it actually doing? Well, it's not trying to copy the judgment of a human doctor. It knows, it understands absolutely nothing about medicine at all. Instead, it's got a database of, I think it's about 140,000 past cases, and it's running what's essentially a pattern recognition algorithm through those cases. Hunting for similarities between all of them and the particular photo of the troubling freckle in question that you've given it. It's performing the task in an unhuman way, based on the analysis of more cases than any human doctor could hope to review in their lifetime. It doesn't matter, and this is the key point, it doesn't matter any longer that a human being struggled to articulate how they perform this task. The system was able to perform it in a fundamentally different way. Now, all of these ideas lead up to an idea which I think is really important, which is what I call the artificial intelligence fallacy. And you see this fallacy not just in popular commentary on the future of work today, but also more expert analysis too. And the fallacy is this. It's sort of inherited from the traditional way in which AI researchers have worked, which is the mistaken assumption that the only way to develop systems that perform tasks at the level of human beings or higher is to copy the way that human beings perform that task. Now, again, that might have been true a few decades ago, before the pragmatist revolution. It's simply no longer the case. And this isn't just something that's caught out my own profession, but it's caught out many leading computer scientists too. So, this man, one of my intellectual heroes, the writer and computer scientist, Douglas Hofstadter, you can see in a really fascinating way in his work how he's fallen foul of this artificial intelligence fallacy over the decades too. So he's best known perhaps for his 1979 cult book, Gödel, Escher, Bach. And at various points in this book, he reflects on the limits of artificial intelligence. And remember, he is also, when he's writing this book, like my dad, like his colleagues, one of the most ambitious, open-minded, progressive people thinking about AI. And towards the end of the book, he writes about the prospect, and this is 1979, He writes about the prospect of AI ever beating a human chess player. Will there ever be an AI that can beat a human being at chess? And he answers, and I quote because he's such a wonderful writer, no. There may be programs which can beat anyone at chess, but they will not be exclusively chess players. They will be programs of general intelligence. Do you want to play chess? No, I'm bored with chess. Let's talk about poetry. Again, you can see the purism here, the belief that only if AI has our sort of intelligence, the intelligence of a human being, what AI researchers call general intelligence, will it be able to win at chess? Of course, that's not true. And Garry Kasparov showed a few decades later that that wasn't right. And then you see Hofstadter reflecting at the turn of the century, 1996, around the time that Kasparov's beaten by Deep Blue. My God, I used to think chess required thought. Now I realize it doesn't. It doesn't mean Kasparov isn't a deep thinker, just that you can bypass deep thinking in playing chess the way you can fly without flapping your wings. I love that idea. So it's this realization that you can build extraordinarily capable machines without copying human intelligence. You can fly without having to flap your wings. And yet you think he's got the point. But take another capability that he explores in this 1979 book, the possibility that AI could ever write music that could rival the work of a great human composer. And again, I want to quote him at length because he is such a wonderful writer. And again, he says no. He says, no, we're not going to build an AI that can ever write a piece of music like a human being. And he says, and this is his reason, he says, music is a language of emotions. And until programs have emotions as complex as ours, there's no way a program will write anything beautiful. This program would have to wander around the world on its own, fighting its way through the maze of life and feeling every moment of it. It would have to understand the joy and loneliness of a chilly night wind, the longing for a cherished hand, the inaccessibility of a distant town, the heartbreak and regeneration after a human death. It would have to have known resignation and world weariness, grief and despair, determination and victory, piety and awe. After Kasparov won at chess, a few years after, he reflects on this paragraph. He says, I've read this paragraph aloud so many times that I practically know it by heart. And what do I make of it now? Well, I'm not quite sure. He starts to have doubts. He's still, in some sense, not wanting to let go of that purism. Fast forward to today, 97% of people can't differentiate between AI-generated and human music, study reveals. Huge amount of evidence suggesting that actually we do a really bad job of distinguishing between music composed by an AI, music composed by a human being. It became clear, again, that he was wrong. Or take another fascination of Hofstadter's, and it sounds like I'm having a go at Hofstadter, but he is really one of my great heroes, so I feel comfortable doing this. Translation. 2018 dismisses the prospect of artificial intelligence ever being able to translate text from one language to another because it lacks real understanding. Again, it's this purism, this idea that only if a machine has our understanding, our thinking, our reasoning processes, will it be able to translate a piece of text effectively. 5 years later, he concedes. He realizes he's wrong. These systems can translate text without copying or imitating or replicating the wonders of the human mind. And so again, I say all of this not to criticize or poke fun at Hofstadter, but to show just how important and how profound this pragmatist revolution has been. Each time he was on the wrong side of the pragmatist revolution, he failed, like economists, like my dad, like so many others, to see that we could build these extraordinarily capable AIs, in some domains already far more capable than us, without having to copy or imitate us. The structure of our brains, the reasoning or thinking that we follow, the rules that we rely upon. So I've shared lots of ideas in this lecture. I want to kind of try now in the final 5 minutes or so just to bring all of these ideas back down to earth. How should we think about them? How can we use them to think about the future of work? And I want to use one idea to do this idea of task encroachment. Now, for those of you who have been to previous lectures, you'll know that the argument I've made is that the impact of technology on work depends upon two very different effects. On the one hand, technology can displace human workers from performing particular tasks and activities. It can substitute for human workers. It can reduce the demand for human beings to do particular tasks and activities. On the other hand, technology can have a second, far more helpful effect, which is that it can increase the demand for human beings to do tasks that haven't yet been automated. And the overall impact of technology on work depends upon the balance between these two competing forces, these two very different effects that technology can have on the work that we do. Harmful substituting effect, helpful complementing effect. One way I've argued to think about the impact of technology on work until now is that despite our worries, despite periodic bursts of anxiety about automation, that helpful complementing force has always won out. There's always been enough demand for the work that human beings have done, despite the existence over time of extraordinary moments of technological progress. The fundamental lesson from this lecture is that economists, computer scientists, many others who found themselves on the wrong side of the pragmatist revolution have found themselves underestimating the strength of the substituting force. They thought that the kind of opacity of the human mind, our inability to explain how we think and reason, to articulate the rules that we followed, represented some kind of constraint on AI. And that turns out to be wrong. That when these systems and machines are able to use remarkable advances in processing power, data storage capability, and particularly in the last few years in algorithm design, to perform tasks in fundamentally different ways to us, a whole new domain of activity that we thought was out of reach turns out not to be out of reach. So one practical impact of this pragmatist revolution is that it seems to me, until recently, we've just been underestimating how strong this harmful substituting effect can get. But although machines can clearly do more than they can in the past, they obviously can't do everything. There's clearly still limits to this harmful substituting force. And the problem for all of us is that these boundaries are really unclear, and they're always changing. So how do we go about drawing the limits to AI? How do we say AI is going to be able to do this, but not be able to do this? Well, one approach, which is very popular, is to try and identify particular human faculties that are hard to automate. So a really common finding, for instance, is that new technologies struggle to perform tasks that require social intelligence from human beings, face-to-face interaction, empathetic support. So from 1980 to 2012, jobs that require a high level of human interaction grew by 12% as a share of the US workforce. And there was interesting analysis in the Financial Times, I think it was last week, showing that this sort of story has continued out since 2012. So that's one approach, which is to say, well, look, there are certain human faculties that these systems can't do. Another approach is to consider the tasks themselves and ask whether they have features that make it easier or harder for a machine to handle them. So if you come across a task, for instance, where it's very easy to define the goal and say whether or not the AI has succeeded or not, if it's straightforward to tell whether the goal has been achieved, and also there's lots of data for the machine to learn from, then that task can probably be automated. So identifying cats is a really, a classic example. Simple goal, is this a cat? It's easy to tell whether or not the AI has succeeded. Yes, that is indeed a cat. And there are a sort of slightly disturbing number of photos of cats on the internet with which to train these systems. I think about 6.5 billion photos on one measure. So there's two very different approaches. You can say, well, look, there's these human faculties or there's these particular types of tasks. But it seems to me that the obvious problem with marking out limits of machines in either of these ways is that any conclusions you reach are going to become outdated pretty quickly. People who try to identify these boundaries to machine capabilities are like the proverbial painters of the Forth Rail Bridge in Scotland, a bridge supposedly so long that they had to start repainting it as soon as they got to the end, because by then the paint would have started to peel and you'd have to go back to the start. The point being, spend time coming up with a sensible account of what machines can do today, and the chances are that by the time you've finished, you're probably going to have to start again and readjust. And it seems to me the collapse in the value of that distinction between routine and non-routine tasks in my own profession in economics is a really good example of the folly of drawing tight boundaries between what machines can and cannot do. So my view is that a far more useful way to think about the impact of technology, and particularly the impact of AI on work at the moment, is what I call a process of task encroachment. Because when you look at the three main capabilities that all of us bring to bear in our work, whether it's manual capabilities that require manual dexterity, cognitive capabilities, those that require our capacity for thinking and reasoning, or affective capabilities, our capacity for feelings and emotions. What you see in each of these different domains is AI gradually, but pretty relentlessly, taking on more and more tasks and activities. This pragmatist revolution that I've spoken about today tells us that AI no longer has to try and copy or imitate or replicate the way that we do things to outperform us. What's more, human capabilities in each of these domains, in each of these areas, is not a useful guide to thinking about the limits of machine capabilities in each of these areas when these machines, as they increasingly do, work in very, very different ways from us. So I think, and it's less definitive and it's less certain, it's more ambiguous, but this way of thinking about the impact of AI on work, this idea of task encroachment, this sense that these technologies are gradually but relentlessly encroaching in each of these different areas of our lives, is the most valuable and effective way of thinking about the impact of technology on work. And so in the next lecture, just to give you a teaser for the next time, I want to take this idea of task encroachment, this idea that these technologies are gradually but relentlessly, in an uncertain way, creeping into other areas of our working lives, and to think about what it means for the future of work. Are there going to be enough jobs for people to do? If there are, what are the challenges? If there's not, what are the challenges then? And I want to focus on that first observation. In my view, the challenge for the next 5 to 10 years is not one of mass unemployment. It's not one where this process of task encroachment leads to large pools of unemployed people. There is going to be work for people to do. There's going to be demand for the work that we all do. But for various reasons, that work is going to sit increasingly out of our reach. And it's going to require a particular set of interventions from us as individuals, from businesses, from governments, in order to get people into these new types of job. And so that's what I want to turn to next. So thank you very much indeed, everyone. And I look forward to hearing some questions and reflections now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got time for questions. In the hall, if you would like to raise your hand, my colleague Kia is going to bring you the microphone. And then we've got some really interesting questions online. Online, you should see a little QR code on the screen as well. Let's start with one from the internet, because you're also, apart from being a research professor at King's College London, you're also a senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics in AI.
Yeah.
One of the questions we had online was, if you think of democracy as a system that is based on consent, can AI ever be considered to be democratic?
Yeah. So, I mean, the impact of AI on politics, not just on democracy, but on liberty, on social justice, on the sort of entire kind of social scaffolding on which we've built and we live our lives, I think is really important. In the context of this lecture, I think it's important. I spent a lot of time today talking about the technical limits of artificial intelligence, what it is that these systems can do and can't do, and how it is, over time, people have, in my view, tended to underestimate the technical capabilities of these technologies. But there's then another question, not about the technical limits of these technologies, but the moral limits, not what they can and cannot do, but what they should and should not do. We can already see these moral limits to automation constraining us. We're already able to use these technologies to do far more than we currently use them to do. And I think the most immediate example is probably the military setting, where there are agreements, for instance, around not having AI in nuclear control systems. There are attempts to get greater agreement on AI not having a role in autonomous weaponry. These moral limits, I think, as you start to look further into the future, are going to become more and more important relative to the kind of technical limits. These questions about, we are going to be able to use these systems to do so much more than we can today, but we won't, not for technical reasons, but it seems to me for moral ones. And those conversations, and that's why it's wonderful to be involved at that institute in Oxford, those questions about the ethics of artificial intelligence require a very different type of expertise, not just economists, but philosophers and other types of social scientists, and it's a really important frontier in this debate.
Thank you. Any questions in the hall?
It'd be really useful for me as well, just for people in the room, if you say who you are and what you do, just to put the question in a bit of context. That'd be great.
My name is Steve Farina, and I am a teacher of economics.
Great.
By an economic point of view, we know that in our economic system here in England today, we have the problem that productivity is stagnating.
Yes.
We are below 1%. How many years do you think artificial intelligence, the artificial intelligence revolution will need to increase our productivity, not to 7-8%, but say from below 1% to say 2%?
Yeah.
And the second question is about the GDPR of the European Union.
Yes.
Do you think that it could stop or not favoring the artificial intelligence revolution in mainland Europe?
Yes, two great questions. I mean, the first question is the sort of blunt answer is I don't know, because that isn't simply a technical question about can these systems perform tasks more productively than those tasks are performed at the moment, but at what rate, what pace these systems are adopted throughout the economy. And that is a question not of economics, that's a question of kind of, in part, sociology and politics. The most recent book I wrote called Growth, A Reckoning, one of the central arguments of that book is that if we want more growth, it's got to come from productivity growth, and that in turn is going to come from technological progress, and that in turn is going to come from artificial intelligence. And so part of what I've been trying to do in my work is encourage politicians and policymakers and business leaders to embrace these technologies. So in a sense, that the answer to that question, it's not a technical one. It depends upon the willingness of people, leaders, to embrace these technologies. And my recurring argument over the last 18, 24 months has been, we're not doing that enough. GDPR, could have a longer conversation about it. I think the European Union has good, appropriate intentions in wanting to regulate the technology, but in some sense, the EU now has the best regulated, non-existent technology sector in the world. And it seems to me, and if you talk to many policymakers and politicians in Europe, they recognize this. So it is a challenge. I think GDPR is part of the story. It's not just the whole story. One of the most, just to kind of bring that, one of the most striking observations was made by Mario Draghi, the European economist, in the Draghi report, where he was looking at, which was a sort of a really fascinating report done in the last few years into innovation and the lack of it in Europe. And he was trying to understand why it was, since the financial crisis, the US economy has done so extraordinarily well, whereas the UK and the European Union have done so poorly. one observation I find really striking, if you take the UK, take London out the UK, the average income of what remains is less now than the poorest state in the US, Mississippi. I don't think people in Britain understand how poor we have become relative to the US over the last couple of decades. It's not just a UK story, it's a European one as well. Draghi asks why, and his answer is, in short, that the US has this extraordinary technology sector that Europe doesn't, and that's been the source of the sorts of productivity increases that have driven the US over the last 2 decades that we just haven't seen here. And so again, it seems to me that addressing that sort of innovation gap is really important.
Okay, could you maybe go?
Hello, I'm Lawrence Pitts. I'm a retired chartered surveyor. I'm fascinated by the way that people were predicting what AI could not do.
Yes.
And yet proven incorrect. That's what history has proven. In your opinion, what areas do you think AI could not do, and which areas do you think you will be proven wrong in due course?
Yes. I mean, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about if you listen to the leaders of the large, and I've spoken about this in previous lectures, but if you listen to the leaders of the large technology companies at the moment, all of them say roughly the same thing, which is that within the next decade or so, we are going to build systems that can outperform us at every economically useful task that we do. Now, there are obviously lots of reasons not to take those claims seriously, not least the kind of strong financial interest that the companies have in talking up the capabilities of their technologies, but nevertheless, we've never invested so much in the pursuit of a single technical problem. The amount of extraordinarily talented people who are going into computer science and trying to build these systems, and also the fact that just we are making extraordinary progress on almost every benchmark in which we're judging these systems are getting more and more capable. So part of my time I spend asking this question, okay, in a world where these systems and machines could do, let's just take the premise. Imagine a world where these systems and machines could do everything economically useful that we do. Would there still be paid work for us in that world? And I think the answer is still yes. And the reason I think yes is because I think there are many things, not just in our working lives, but in life in general, where what we value is not simply how well a task is done, but how it's done. And so let me give you an example. I went on a tour of the Vatican a few years ago. You walk into the Sistine Chapel at the end, you look up at this roof and you think, gosh, isn't that beautiful? But you also think, isn't it amazing that a human being painted that a kind of flesh and blood hand like my own did that? And if that is the thing that you value, the very fact that a human being has done that task, then it's hard to see how an AI, given that it isn't human, will ever be able to do that. And it's not just, it's not just art. I mean, there are so many areas of our lives where this is true. It's, the handcrafted suit, even if it's perhaps a little bit ill-fitting compared to the off-the-shelf alternative. It's there's a wonderful story about a Michelin star restaurant somewhere in England where it was at the start of the kind of capsule coffee-based coffee revolution, and there was sort of all the buzz, and they had, I think it was an espresso machine, and they didn't tell the customers that they were serving capsule-based coffee. And it turns out that in blind taste tests, we struggle to tell the difference between capsule-based coffee and the sort of coffee made by a human barista. And when, in spite of that, when people in the restaurant found out they were being served coffee from a machine, they were livid, they were furious, they felt they had been hoodwinked. And the reason wasn't because the coffee tasted worse, it was because they were paying for a process, not simply an outcome, and in particular a human process. And so I think there are many, many areas of our lives where we value the human process, not simply the outcome. And it's quite an interesting exercise to think about what parts of our lives that is, and that's part of what I've been trying to do. So I think even in a world where these systems could do everything, we may not necessarily have a taste or preference for them to do it.
Just looking at the clock, I think we've got time for one more question. Kia, could you maybe have someone from the other side of the hall.
I wonder if you could comment on the obsession that mainstream economists have with task analysis, whether it's substitution or complementing humans. What about the impact on aggregate demand? It's not just about the supply side effects. What about the demand side effects, particularly bearing in mind the radical income redistribution that's going to occur because of AI?
Yeah, so I think your observation there is absolutely right, which is, and I'll come to this in later lectures, but it seems to me that the fundamental problem created by these technologies is that, on the one hand, they make us collectively extraordinarily prosperous. They allow us to perform tasks far more productively. They allow us to do tasks in the past we might not have even been able to do before. The challenge of these technologies, in other words, is not really one about the fact that they might make us more... if we think of the economy as a pie, as economists like to do, the challenge is not so much how do we make the pie larger. The challenge is, well, how do we then share out this pie if these technologies undermine our traditional way of slicing it up, which is paying people in the labor market for the work that they do. So I think that the challenge of these technologies, as you think about them becoming more and more capable, and as you look further into the 21st century, becomes a challenge fundamentally of distribution. How do we share out the prosperity created by these technologies if our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, is less effective than it might have been in the past? That feels to me to be the really pressing economic question, so I agree with that observation.
I feel really bad, but we're out of time. So thank you very much for attending,
very
whether
much.
it's online or here, and thank you very much for your questions.